This is part 2. Darin will launch into talking about D-Day and finish up the section on closing in on Germany, and then I will cover closing in on Japan, and that will be the end of chapter 15. Thank you.
So D-Day was planned for June the 6th, 1944. We learn that it was planned exceptionally well by a British general named Frederick Morgan, and he had a year's worth of planning involved closer to the event. Of course, Eisenhower flew across and stepped in to take charge and to run and control the plan as had been agreed earlier on. Quigley describes the futile effect aerial bombing had from pages 782 to 783. And ultimately, by 1944, the Allies had improved the use of bombing to achieve some meaningful results. Germany began to experience manpower and pilot shortages. Quickly points out an example where the Germans, they just didn't have enough time to train their pilots, and at one point, accidents were equal to planes that were downed in action. The Germans were poorly prepared to cope with any Allied landing in the West. 2/3 of their forces were fighting in Russia and Eastern Europe, and the rest had to be spread from the Aegean to the Pyrenees, and thence north to Norway and Finland. The drain on German manpower and vital materials was so great that the country grew steadily weaker. Still, it fought on, the leaders becoming more and more ruthless and more remote from reality, until finally they were living in an insane frenzy of hatred, suspicion, and frustration. Lack of manpower, particularly of trained hands, and lack of materials, even as such ordinary commodities as concrete or steel, made it impossible to strengthen German defenses to the necessary degree. Above all, lack of gasoline made it impossible even to withdraw equipment before the advancing Russians. In the last 2 months of 1943, the German armies lost almost 1,000 tanks and half as many self-propelled guns to Soviet forces. Repairs became as difficult to achieve as new construction. You can see that this book has had multiple authors, that he's definitely taken sections and given them to students because, well, we see that Melissa early on pointed out something which this section has immediately repeated word for word. And then later on in the same section, there's almost a contradiction where we find out that Germany had plenty of resources. So anyway, okay, so German forces in the West were not of the same muster as the troops doing battle with Russia and elsewhere in Europe. They weren't battle-hardened. They consisted of older men. They were more into maintaining the situation in France. And they weren't the real young, vigorous, strong soldiers. Germany had to actually shuffle his good troops back and forth between two fronts. As the Anglos, American forces entered from the Channel and upward from the Mediterranean, he had to divert forces from the Russian front to the Western front, and sometimes he had to shift them back again to the east. We learn regarding Operation Overlord that German fortifications were actually very, very weak. On the day of Operation Overlord, there was significant good fortune for the Allies. I'll read here. The desired landing conditions were low tide, just after dawn, following a moonlit night. These occurred only once a month and lasted for only 3 days. In June 1944, these days were the 5th, 6th, and 7th. Bad weather, making air operations difficult, and impossibly heavy surf forced Eisenhower to postpone the attack on June the 5th. And here's the thing, it's quite another stroke of luck, but because better weather information, expertly interpreted, showed the Allies that the weather would improve suddenly, the Supreme Commander ordered the attack to take place on June the 6th, at a time when the Germans expected the adverse weather to continue. That's a huge stroke of luck there. Quigley goes into the details of the launch onto the beaches, who was where, which forces were where. The gist of it is that the German fortifications were, once again, they were weak. As they got over the beachhead, the Germans did fight viciously. And we also learned that this religious tenacity of the Nazis took them to a bitter end. They fought viciously right up to the very end. On page 786, Quigley mentions efforts to assassinate Hitler. And I don't know if you will remember, I think Tom Cruise, he acted in the movie, I think it was, is it Valkyrie? I'll just read from this page here. On July the 20th, 1944, however, success seemed near when Colonel Count Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, Chief of Staff of the Home Army, made his daily report to Hitler and left the conference without picking up his briefcase, which rested against the leg of the Führer's chair. In the briefcase was an English-made bomb with a 10-minute fuse. When the bomb exploded, Stauffenberg gave the signal for the military units in Berlin, Paris, and elsewhere to seize control of these areas from the fanatical Nazi SS units. Unfortunately, Hitler's conference on July the 20th, because of the heat, was held in a wooden shed instead of the usual concrete bunker. This allowed the explosion to dissipate itself. Moreover, a few seconds before the bomb went off, Hitler left his chair to go to a map on the most distant wall of the conference room. So he escaped just with minor scratches, really. This was broadcast on the radio by the Nazis, and the conspirators were rounded up, and about 5,000 of the 7,000 suspects were killed, usually after weeks or even months of horrible tortures. A few, like Field Marshal Rommel, was allowed to commit suicide as a special reward for his past services to the Nazis. As a consequence of this fiasco, the anti-Hitler opposition was destroyed. The most fanatical and least sane Nazis increased their power within Germany. Any chance of negotiating peace, admittedly a remote possibility at all times, became impossible. So, yeah, things just got more nuts within Germany. It's also interesting who these anti-Hitler elements were. They tended to be the more sort of upper crust. American forces fighting in Germany were extremely good. They were very resilient and tough. The Battle of the Bulge proved that Americans certainly had a lot of fight in them. The Battle of the Bulge is quite a famous battle. It took place in the, I think it's the Ardennes forest. The Americans were at one point surrounded in absolutely desperate straits, and sheer tenacity, sheer resilience won them the day. It was quite a famous, well-known event in American military history. By then, Russia was encroaching on Hitler. He had to send troops from this battle, from the Battle of the Bulge, to face the Russians in the east. And I'll read from page 789, the bottom. The Allied advance in the west was regarded with mixed feelings in Moscow, where there was real concern that the Germans might shift all their strength to the east to oppose Russia, while admitting the Anglo-American forces in the west. The Germans regarded the Russians as subhumans, roused to frenzy by German atrocities on Soviet soil, and had every reason to fear Russian occupation and retaliation. while everyone knew that any American occupation would be motivated by humanitarian considerations rather than by retaliation. The Nazi leaders were too much absorbed in their own irrationalities to adopt such tactics as these. However, although the Soviet leaders continued to dread the possibility and convinced themselves, in spite of the contradictory evidence, and convinced themselves that it was likely, accordingly the Soviet advance became a race with the Western powers, even though these powers, by Eisenhower's orders, held back their advance at many points, such as Prague, to allow the Russians to occupy areas the Americans could easily have taken first. We won't really know the details behind that. Somebody higher up somewhere said, no, we want the Russians to take this. A lot of decisions are made like that, where soldiers on the ground in times of these wars are left absolutely bewildered, because the average soldier in that situation knows that just around the corner, the target is there for the taking, and yet some higher up says, no, just pause, stop, that's where you're stopping, no further. And so, read between the lines, there are higher geopolitical plans at stake, and you have to wonder who really is at war with who. So a race began between the Americans and the Russians to get to Berlin. America could have gotten to certain areas before the Russians, but let the Russians have these areas, as we've seen. The Russians, once the Germans were on the back foot, advanced rapidly. From midsummer 1943 until the war's end in May 1945, the Soviet offensive in the east was almost continuous. In January 1944, Russian forces crossed the old border into Poland. In February, they pushed back the besieged Germans from Leningrad, and in the following month, they began a southern offensive which crossed the Prut into Romania. In 1944, the Soviet armies reached the Vistula River across from Warsaw and began an offensive to overrun Romania. These events raised in acute form the problem of who would rule over the liberated areas of Eastern Europe. We have the examples of Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Greece, and it's actually quite difficult to explain, but essentially in Romania and Bulgaria, interests within those countries decided it would be the greater wisdom to side with the Soviets. Yugoslavia, very similar. You had opposing forces within those countries. You had a communist forces, and you had the old original government, which were usually in exile. The Soviet interests got the upper hand, and so post-war in those areas became fully entrenched by the Soviets. Let's see here. So it was very clear that the great powers, or the allies, and the Russians were not going to cooperate during peacetime as they did during war. Such a possibility was foreclosed by two factors: the fundamental underlying suspicions on both sides, even in wartime, and the very nature of the political power of modern states. For these two reasons, both sides, in the midst of reassuring public statements about their solidarity of outlook and plans for post-war cooperation, began to work toward another, more realistic arrangement of spheres of interest and power balances. This alternative and ultimately inevitable path was adopted earlier by Stalin and Churchill than by Roosevelt. Not because Roosevelt was naive or ill, but because he wanted to smother the naked opposition of power balances by a chaotic blanket of legal restrictions, conflicting public opinion, and alternative institutional arrangements which would hamper the outright operation of power conflicts, and which would allow men like himself to divert and postpone crises from day to day, while they improvised better economic and social arrangements for their peoples in their successive intervals of peace, won from the postponement of forcible solutions to power conflicts. It's a bit of a mouthful. None of this could be achieved, in Roosevelt's view, unless Stalin's mania of suspicion of capitalist powers could be reduced by granting him as concessions things he could not be prevented from taking anyway. In the last resort, Roosevelt's sense of the realities of power were quite as acute as Churchill's or Stalin's, but he concealed that sense much more deliberately and much more completely under a screen of high-sounding moral principles and idealistic statements of popular appeal. It is unlikely that Roosevelt had any alternative plan based on power politics to fall back on if his stated aims of post-war cooperation and United Nations failed. Churchill, on the other hand, while sincerely pursuing cooperative goals, had a secondary outline based on power balance and sphere of interest. Stalin reversed Churchill's priorities, giving primary position to spheres of power and secondary, rather ironic acceptance of cooperation and international organizations. Yeah, he then points out that the tactics that Stalin used to get Soviet influence into these Eastern European states was very, very similar to the tactic that Hitler used to get the Nazi ideals across in, for example, Czechoslovakia and Austria. It consisted of 4 general points. That was to establish a coalition government containing communists. You know, in the German point of view, it would be Nazis. 2, to get in communist hands the ministries of defense, which is the army, the interior, which is the police, and if possible, the courts. 3, to use administrative decrees to take over education and the press and to cripple opposition political parties. And 4, to establish finally a completely communist regime under the protection of Soviet military forces if necessary. The success of these steps in Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania was assured while the war was continuing by the Western powers' acceptance of coalition governments containing communists as a necessary price for Soviet security locally and for Soviet cooperation elsewhere, especially in the Far East with Japan, and by the fact that Russian armies were in occupation of the areas concerned. Yeah, so we understand the game of chess being played, and if you watch an average sort of World War II documentary, these points aren't really brought out to the general public. Everyone was just flying by their seat of their pants, and, you know, by sheer luck and bravery, certain battles were won and certain countries were saved, you know. But it's quite nice to read a book like Tragedy and Hope, where you see the rationale, how these great powers, for example, had to face off each other in strategy. So August 1944, we read Romania and Bulgaria, they pulled themselves out of the war. They accepted communism and Russian hegemony, and therefore the Nazis were forced out of these 2 countries. So there is that ebb. We see the retreat of the Germans' forces from that point of view. Soviet forces then entered Yugoslavia and the north into Hungary. And by January the 20th, 1945, Hungary had technically ceded government to Russia. I'll read here. As might be inferred, the Polish settlement was even less happy than the Yugoslav one, since the Poles were under the full weight of the Soviet armies and inaccessible to Western power. As early as 1943, the Polish cabinet in London, which operated an underground army and an underground government in Poland, was threatened by Russian demands that the Polish eastern frontier be moved westward to the Curzon line, and that the anti-Soviet members of the government be removed. Futile negotiations dragged on for months. In July 1944, when the Soviet armies were approaching the Vistula, a communist Polish Committee of National Liberation was set up under Soviet protection in Russia. It claimed full legal sovereignty over Poland under the Constitution of 1921 and denounced the Polish government in London as illegal. So both Polish ministers, well, they hurried from London to Moscow to negotiate. British ministers themselves also got quite involved, but long story short, the Russian armies, this quasi-Polish government that they set up, they managed to force the Germans out of Poland, and history takes care of itself from there. And yeah, the poor old Poles were under the communist yoke up until 1989. After all that suffering, I think possibly the Poles suffered the worst out of anyone. Greece was fortunate. Greece was spared from Soviet occupation due to a very strong British presence in that region. In spite of these conflicts with communist elements in Eastern Europe, the Western powers continued to cooperate with the Soviet Union. Well, there we go. In the military subjugation of Germany and the diplomatic negotiations to establish a general post-war arrangement. In the latter negotiations, the problem of a European, particularly a German, post-war settlement was inextricably mingled with the establishment of a world security organization. The central core of both was the hope that the three great powers would be able to cooperate in peace as they had done in war, but this rather tenuous hope was concealed under a mass of other considerations. We have already seen the dominant role played in Soviet operations by Russia's insistence on security along its western frontier. Britain had equally forceful aspirations, of which the chief were to prevent an American reversion into post-war isolationism and to maintain the unity of the Commonwealth. The Roosevelt administration in Washington was equally fearful of any resurgence of American isolationism and hoped to avoid it by a symphonic appeal to mingled notes of American idealism and interests. The United States would be the greatest power in a world security organization which would prevent future wars, except America they wouldn't follow any of these virtues. They would basically set up military bases all over the world and blow up many groups of people over and over again. Under that peace, in air quotes, the world would be reconstructed economically to satisfy the basic needs of all human beings, or rather, the basic needs of the American establishment. End poverty and disease by American technical skill and science, and raise standards of living everywhere to the simultaneous satisfaction of American idealism and American industry's need for profitable markets. On page 797, Quigley just mentions again that retreating German forces were utterly sadistic. In Germany itself, they went into a psychotic state of really accelerating the original eugenicist plans. Calls it in a frenzy of murder and torture. Once again, Quigley calls it, this is where he calls it the Nazi psychosis. When these victorious armies broke into Germany in late 1944, the Nazis were still holding the survivors of 8 million enslaved civilian workers, 10 million Jews, 5.75 million Russian prisoners of war, and millions of prisoners from other armies. Over half of the Jews and Russians, and several millions of the others, possibly 12 million in all, were killed by murder, overwork, or deliberate neglect before final victory in the spring of 1945. Yeah, as Melissa was saying earlier, what humans did to each other, the sheer weight of numbers and statistics in pain and suffering and death and torture, and to think that all these people who carried it out were simply controlled mostly through the power of the spoken word. the clever scientific use of linguistic neural programming, understanding human fears, just like the C event of 2020, people, they weren't really subdued or forced to do anything. No one came to your house and put a mask on your face. The people, being so asleep really, not understanding themselves, they lived 2020 into existence. They practiced it. They were the ones who carried it out to themselves mostly. 2020 was an eye-opener to people who wondered why Hitler could have done what he had done, how many Germans behaved the way they did, how so many people in the world behaved the way they did, until we can wake up out of our coma. Yeah, I'm speechless, because we even take a look at some of these most sadistic leaders of these communist regimes. You probably find that very few of these guys ever carried a weapon on themselves, or had ever fired a round or had shot anyone in cold blood. They spoke, they issued orders, and ordinary people like you and me generally went around murdering and killing, and not once did these people stop to catch themselves in the act, as it were. If only they had done that. Even years later, 20, 30, 40, 50 years after the war, you'll have these guys who served in the war, and they'll have a D-Day celebration or whatever it is, and they'll attend, the few that are remaining, and with all their sentiment, they will remember the brave and fallen, but they'll never stop to think about who instigated. They'll never even bother to investigate who stirred all this stuff up. It's very, very, very tragic, exceptionally tragic. On page 798, Hitler's fanatical devotion to destruction made surrender impossible and drove the war on to its bitter end. This bitterness was carried to the majority of Germans by the combined bomber offensive approved by the combined chiefs of staff on June the 10th, 1943. Before this offensive, the bombardment of Germany from the air was of little significance. In the whole war, almost 1.5 million tons of bombs were dropped on Germany, but only 15,000 tons of this fell in 1940, and about 46,000 tons in 1941. The 1942 figure, even with the help of the United States 8th Air Force, was only 7 tons higher than that of 1941. Thus, 95% of the total bombs dropped in Germany in the war fell after January 1943. Then Quigley goes on to remind us about Giulio Douhet. He was a Italian who started the bad idea that aerial bombardment would be indomitable, that it would end the war quickly, and that it would be very, very effective, etc., etc. He points out that the Germans and the Russians didn't pay any attention to that, but the Americans and the British seemed to be quite charmed by what this Italian had to say. Quigley goes on to explain how ineffective aerial bombing really was. It's pointless to go into it. He's already covered it in previous chapters. But what we do learn is that towards the end of the European war in Germany, that the Allies started to bomb the cities. He just takes us through a brief history of why cities were bombed, and he just mentions that the attack on cities began by accident when a group of German planes, which were lost, dumped their bomb loads, contrary to orders, on London. On August 24th, 1940, the Royal Air Force retaliated by bombing Berlin the next night. On September the 12th, 1940, as counter-retaliation, Goering announced the beginning of city bombardment for September the 7th. But the policy had already begun with a series of attacks on Liverpool after August the 28th. And so there you had this endless cycle of bombing cities. Towards the last phase of this war in Germany, quickly tells us that the Allied aerial forces, they stepped up their game, they improved their targeting, they managed to inflict a few significant and effective blows to Germans' ability to fight the war. I think they managed to hit a ball bearing factory, they managed to hit their petroleum factories. The British effort to break German civilian morale by area night bombing was an almost complete failure. In fact, one of the inspiring and amazing events of the war was the unflinching spirit under unbearable attack shown by ordinary working people in industrial cities. This was made true in Russia, points to Leningrad as an example, as it was in Germany or Britain. Attacks on these peoples had a greater influence on the morale of the soldiers fighting on the front than it did on the suffering peoples themselves in the cities. And then he points out the example of the British bombing raids on Hamburg. We also know about the one in Dresden. I think the one in Dresden is more well known. But the bombing was so intense through a mixture of using high explosive and incendiary bombs. It was so constant and persistent that entirely new conditions of destruction known as firestorms appeared. So the air in the city becomes superheated and rises, and it has such a powerful upflowing force that it sucks in fresh oxygen from the sides. And that fresh oxygen then fuels and superheats the air in the whole city. You know, people would be walking along and sort of instantly combust. Even if they were completely wrapped up in clothing saturated in water, it would just instantly steam and burn them, scald them. And once the firestorm got to a certain size, the fresh oxygen that would be sucked in from the sides couldn't compete with the volume of carbon monoxide that was produced by the fire, the smoke. So even if you were seeking shelter in a sort of little underground basement or something, the air was unbreathable, and so people just suffocated to death in all kinds of interesting places. Absolutely horrific. No final figures for the destruction were possible until 1951. He's talking about Hamburg here, when they were set by German authorities at 40,000 dead, including 5,000 children, 250,000 houses destroyed, with over 1 million people made homeless. This was the greatest destruction by air attacks on a city until the fire raid on Tokyo of March the 9th, 1945, which still stands today as the most devastating air attack in human history. I remember traveling on a business trip down what we call the Garden Route. It's from Port Elizabeth towards Cape Town, and at this time there were severe forest fires along that route. So if I'm driving down in the direction towards Cape Town, on my right would be the mountain range, a long mountain range along that route, 200-300 kilometers worth. And when I got halfway, the fire was so intense that the day turned to night. It was literally dark. And what happened next was that from my left, from the seaside of the road, a sudden wind blew across from the left to the right, up the mountain to the right. I remembered this. It immediately made me think of the Dresden bombing, because you clearly had fresh oxygenated air being sucked at an incredible rate. It was like it was basically gale force sucking across the road. It was quite something to experience. So, following the Battle of the Bulge, a pincer movement encircled the Ruhr industrial area. That's on page 805. We learn that Germany would still have been defeated because in the long run its position was hopeless once Hitler attacked Russia while Britain was still undefeated. This defeat arose from the destruction of the German armies in battle and was made inevitable from the economic point of view by the loss of the Romanian oil supply in August 1944 and the loss of the Ruhr industrial region in April 1945. One unforeseen and still largely unrecognized event in the defeat of Germany's ground armies was Hitler's greater resistance to Western than to Soviet advances. It had been assumed, especially in the Kremlin, that Hitler's hatred of communism would lead him to weaken his defenses in the West in order to resist more effectively the advance of Russia. He did exactly the opposite. In the late summer of 1944, 2/3 of Germany's fighting men were resisting the Russians in the East, at 2 million in all, with 300,000 in Italy and 700,000 elsewhere in the West. By the time of the Yalta Conference, Germany had 106 divisions in the West, of which 27 were in Italy, facing an equal number of slightly larger divisions of the Western powers, while they had 133 in the East, 24 less than in June 1944, of which only 75 faced Russia's 100 divisions, who had 80 more in reserve, along the 600-mile front from the Carpathian Mountains to the Baltic. This shift in German forces can be explained on military grounds, but the real causes were much deeper and were embedded in the distorted recesses of Hitler's brain and in the very nature of Nazism. I made a note here that it's my personal opinion, but I think that this thinking of Hitler was due to a betrayal of the British, a betrayal by the Chatham House, the inner circle groups, because what I noticed earlier in the chapters so far is that with the appeasement of Hitler, etc., and going into the time of the war where Germany is on the ascendancy, everything just keeps going Hitler's way. Decisions made by Britain, they did everything they could to ensure Hitler's success. And I think that Hitler was set up. I think Hitler was intrigued by an inner circle from the Anglo-American establishment. I think Ribbentrop and Hess and a few other people were involved in this inner circle on the German side. I think certain promises were made by the Anglo-American establishment to ensure that Germany would be the dominant power in Europe, and I think Hitler took the bait. And then I think as things went along, I think the Anglo-American group, I think they pulled the carpet out from under his feet. And I think he realized that he had been set up. And I think that is the reason why he fought to the bitter end. And as we read, he and his wife committed suicide in a bunker. Because he probably knew that there's absolutely no way in hell that they would let him live post-war. He had been completely set up, in my opinion. On the 28th of April, 1945, I assume Mussolini, on his way to the Swiss frontier with extensive treasure, see, they always run away with the loot, was captured and killed by Italian guerrillas. His body was taken back to Milan, scene of his earliest triumphs, to hang by the heels in a public square alongside that of his mistress, Clara Petacci. Meanwhile, General Eisenhower, following the victory in the Ruhr, ignored Berlin to the northeast and drove directly eastward toward Dresden. He was unduly disturbed by rumors that the Germans had prepared a final defensive redoubt in southeastern Germany. Churchill and others, for political bargaining purposes, wanted the American advance redirected to Berlin, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington refused to interfere with Eisenhower's decisions in the field. These decisions, based on military considerations only and ignoring political factors, permitted the Soviet forces to, in air quotes, liberate all of the capital cities of Central Europe. Budapest fell to the Russians on February the 13th, followed by Vienna on April the 13th. On April the 25th, Russian forces encircled Berlin and made contact with American troops 70 miles to the south. In the meantime, the Russian troops, screaming, looting, and raping, were smashing into Berlin. On April the 20th, following Hitler's 56th birthday celebration, which most of the Nazi party and military leaders attended, the Führer refused to leave the doomed city. Most of the rest escaped that night through the last narrow corridor to central Germany. For another 9 days, Hitler continued to telephone orders from his bunker in the garden of the new Chancellery building, but few paid any attention to these. His former lieutenants were scattered throughout central Germany, intriguing to take over as leader or planning to vanish from sight. Only Goebbels, with his wife and 6 young children, and Hitler's mistress, Eva Braun, planned to remain in the end. The Führer experienced a complete mental breakdown in April the 22nd. A week later, only a few subordinates remained to carry out his wishes. With Russian shells falling all about the Chancellery, he married Eva Braun. So he made a woman of her. Ordered Goering and Himmler arrested for treachery and drew up a political testament which blamed the war and all Germany's misfortunes on the Jews, and told the nation the aim must still be to win territory in the East for the German people. On the afternoon of April the 30th, 1945, with the Russian soldiers only a block away, Eva Braun took poison and Hitler shot himself through the mouth. Subordinates, in accord with their instructions, flooded the bodies with gasoline and burned them in a Russian shell hole in the Chancellery garden. Some say that he escaped to Argentina, and I won't go through it, but quickly just refers to what the Americans and the British discovered with regards to the concentration camps. That Hitler's government, in practice, was making every effort to carry out all the vile purposes which it embraced in theory had been made explicitly clear to all informed persons by 1939, most notably perhaps in The Revolution of Nihilism by Hermann Rauschning, former Nazi leader in Danzig, or in the Brown Book of the Hitler Terror, based on evidence from refugees and published in 1933. There was no excuse for the world's press to be surprised at the Nazi bestiality in 1945, since the evidence had been fully available in 1938. By VE Day, May the 8th, 1945, this bestiality had brought death to more than 30 million human beings as sacrifices to mystic Germanic tribalism. And that closes off that section. Melissa, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Darin. That was very good. Thanks. So this is closing in on Japan, 1943 to 1945. And I'll just set it up by reading the first 2 paragraphs. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Japan was already defeated, but could not make itself accept unconditional surrender, and was trying to stave off that inevitable end by suicide tactics. In the 35 months from the Battle of Midway to the German surrender, the Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine had been swept from the Western Pacific and largely destroyed in the process, cutting the home islands off from vital overseas supplies, leaving millions of their armed forces isolated in Southeast Asia, China, New Guinea, the Philippines, and other island pockets. The war against Germany and the war against Japan were separate wars, although involving the same victorious nations. Weapons, strategy, and tactics were quite different, chiefly because one was a war of air and land, while the other was a struggle of naval and air forces over an immense ocean. Even American strategic bombing was different in the Pacific, using B-29s, unknown in Europe for area bombing of civilians in cities, something we disapproved in Europe. The great weapons against Japan were the aircraft carriers, which relentlessly prowled the ocean and provided the necessary protection for amphibious assaults on the island stepping stones which led to Japan. The total destruction of the Japanese Navy and Air Force were almost incidental to this process of protecting landing forces of Marines and Army units. He goes on to write that even when the same weapons were used in the European and Pacific struggles, the outcomes were different. One thing that is just interesting to think about is why would it be okay to bomb civilians in the war on Japan, but not in Europe? Immediately after Midway, then the vital issue for the U.S. was the need to stop the Japanese advance against Australia in the southwestern Pacific. So Japan's advance base was on Rabaul on New Britain Island, which they had taken from Australia in January 1942. The American counterattack to the Japanese southward push was 2 parallel thrusts northward. So we're about to have a visual here. If you don't know the land masses involved, that's okay, because Quigley builds a ladder. He shows that the technique is actually called a ladder. So there's 2 parallel thrusts northward. They pass to the east and the west of Rabaul and Truk, and the western thrust was under General MacArthur to reconquer New Guinea. The eastern American thrust was under the naval control. I guess I didn't make a note of who was controlling it, but it was to go northward through the Solomon Islands, to bypass Rabaul and Truk, and through the Marshall Islands. This double movement is referred to as a ladder, in which alternative advances on either side by the Americans led to Japanese counterattacks from Rabaul and Truk between the 2 legs of the ladder. So the Americans are the legs of the ladder, and the counterattacks are the rungs of the ladder. The Americans managed to keep the supplies steady. They kept it going, but Japanese support was intermittent. The plan was that MacArthur and Stilwell would converge on China from the Philippines and Burma, and they would establish a mainland base from which they could conduct the final assault on Japan. This was called the Burma Campaign, and it was held up or slowed down by how difficult it was because of the terrain and the fact that men and supplies were constantly being diverted to other theaters of war. So the Burma Campaign did not reach China over their hand-built, what they would call the Burma Road, until February of 1945. The Eastern Drive that began in early August of 1942. Guadalcanal was invaded by naval and marine forces, starting from the Wellington, New Zealand. That was August. So by February 1943, after 6 months of intense jungle fighting, most often without air or sea support, the Solomon Islands were finally conquered. In the autumn of 1943, the Allied forces had reached the Great Barrier of the Japanese-mandated islands, and those were in the Central Pacific. And the series of amphibious operations that were needed to do this, that was called island hopping. The landing on Tarawa, they lost 3,100 Marines. Well, actually, a third of them, Quigley said they were torn to pieces, and a third of them fatally. And so 3,100 Marines to capture a coral island that was defended by 2,700 Japanese soldiers and 2,000 civilian laborers. So that's 4,700 bodies. And Quigley said that the fanaticism of the Japanese could be measured by the fact that of those 4,700, 4,500 of them were killed. But that operation taught the U.S. forces, the Allied forces, how detailed their knowledge and advanced planning had to be regarding tides and winds and reefs and also local fire support. In February of 1943, all of the experience that they were gaining in that operation, they applied to another operation on Kwajalein, which is the world's largest atoll. So Quigley describes the Japanese fighting as skillful, mostly skillful, until the outcome was hopeless, and then they made suicidal banzai charges. The Americans advanced up the right leg of the ladder so far ahead of schedule that some of their projected landings had to be eliminated, and then future landings were advanced in date. Because of the speed with which they were moving, it left them three major problems. They needed to finally end up on an island that was close enough to Japan for that preliminary bombardment and to have their planes close enough. Then there was the possibility that there would be a lot of American casualties when the Japanese invasion happened that they were expecting. And then there was the question of what could be done about all the millions of Japanese forces that were already in northern China and in Manchuria. So this big need for an air base within range of Japan resulted in the conquest of the Marianas Islands. The Japanese fleet tried to disrupt the Marianas attack, and that led to what they called the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and this was in June of 1944. So let me see if those dates are June 19 and 20, 1944. On July 27th, President Roosevelt, Admiral Nimitz, and General MacArthur met at Pearl Harbor, and they decided that they needed to speed up the assault on Japan, recapture the Philippines, and not wait. See, before this time, a lot of their planning had been, we've got to defeat Germany first, and then we can finish off Japan. But at this meeting, they said, no, we want to capture the Philippines, and we're not going to wait until we've defeated Germany. Then their plan was to force Japan to accept this unconditional terms of surrender, the unconditional surrender, by the use of air and sea power to demonstrate to them that this could be done and they were not going to end up invading the Japanese homeland. Admiral Halsey suggested that 4 planned intermediate landings be halted. And those troops that they were going to use in these intermediate landings would be used for the seizure of Leyte. And within 90 minutes of that suggestion coming to Roosevelt on September the 15th, 1944, he approved it, and the landing began that same day on Palau. So the interesting thing here is that Tokyo already anticipated the time and the place, but they just simply were unable to reinforce. There was one single division there, and they could not reinforce it. So Halsey was in charge of this operation, this landing, and he led the Third Fleet. And let's see, the Third Fleet had 9 fleet carriers, 8 escort carriers, 6 battleships, 14 cruisers, 58 destroyers. The Americans had 1,000 planes in the air. Just think about that. Japanese naval planes had been critically reduced, and they were also short on trained pilots. So it was at this point that they began to adopt the kamikaze tactics. And the kamikaze, they weren't just suicide planes, suicide pilots. They were half-trained pilots. So they didn't have enough planes, and they didn't have adequately trained pilots. So they simply said to these pilots that had very little training, you're going to take the plane up, it's going to be loaded with bombs, and you are going to dive onto the decks of the American ships. The Japanese also planned to send a small force that they were going to use as bait to entice Halsey's Third Fleet away from Luzon, but that failed. Now, Quigley said that their timing, the Japanese timing, was precise and their execution ruthless, but the quality of the American fighting men was far superior to Japanese admirals. And so the superiority of the fighters overcame the Japanese superiority that they had in guts. The Japanese had guts and ships, but in actual combat, the Americans were superior. Kurita, this is on page 813. I don't see a first name, but so Kurita had something called the Center Force, and he hoped that that Center Force would be able to remain undetected, but they were intercepted by American submarines and reported. And on October the 23rd, the American submarines called Darter and Dace torpedoed 3 of Kurita's heavy cruisers, and they sunk 2 of them, including Kurita's flagship. Quigley goes into great detail about the fighting, and I'll skip that, but basically the Battle of Leyte ended the Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. So while General MacArthur and the Army were clearing up the Philippines and capturing Manila, and again, in Manila, it was house-to-house combat. So you can just imagine what that scenario was like. The Navy, the U.S. Navy and Air pressed onward to Japan. And they had 2 intermediate targets that they set. The first was that they wanted to capture Iwo Jima, and that was halfway between Saipan and Tokyo. And they wanted to be able to use Iwo Jima as an emergency landing area and a fighter plane base for their B-29s that were going to attack Tokyo from Saipan. The other objective was to capture Okinawa and some other islands so that they could invade Japan itself. Iwo Jima was invaded on February the 19th and secured by March the 26th. What I don't know and didn't have time to look into was what size was Iwo Jima. How big was it? It doesn't look huge, but what the Japanese had was a whole series of caves that they were hid out in. And so because, at first when I saw that, wow, they got there on the 19th of February and it took them close to 6 weeks to take over the island, but they were in caves. So Quigley said that they had to flush the Japanese out of, one by one out of the caves. And by March the 26th, when they had secured the island, they had almost 21,000 Japanese killed and had only taken 216 prisoners. And then after the 26th, when it was already secured, they were able to, I think, they killed about 2,500 more over the next 2 months. Now, Iwo Jima is that you remember the statue of the soldiers planting that flag. There was the photograph that they were raising the American flag on top of Mount Suribachi. And so it's an iconic photograph that became a statue memorial. And of course it was staged and they had to get it just right. And, so looking at what Mount Suribachi actually looked like and trying to get a visual of the island. And I found that Suribachi means grinding bowl. And it's the Surikogi it's literally means grind powder wood. So it's the Japanese words for mortar and pestle. And that is indeed what the top of the mountain looks like. It's not only flat across the top, so it looks like the top of the mountain's been just sliced right off, but it indents like a bowl. And really, if you think about it, that's what they did on that island, was pulverized men. So the conquest of Okinawa was a very big task because the Chinese mainland was less than 400 miles from Japan and then 400 miles from Formosa. Quigley writes that the assault on the heavily populated Okinawa it's really almost beyond belief. And we learn that the Okinawa campaign was the most severe of the Pacific War. So 77,000 Japanese defenders were there, and most of them were killed or committed suicide. By May of 1945, the average Japanese citizen was completely disillusioned. The Japanese leaders, I guess certainly the civilian, were disillusioned with the war and eager to find a way out. But the army was still, they believed not that they could win, but that they could make the cost of an American invasion on Japan simply too high to be accepted by American opinion. The Japanese had perfected a manned glider bomb that the Americans called Baka. Baka was an American term for it. What was Baka? Well, I can't find the word now, but I think it was something like, foolish. There it is. So the Americans said this is foolish, but this was Japanese fighting style. That it was a manned glider. It was really a glider bomb. And it carried a man and about 2,600 pounds of an explosive called trinitroanisole. And I don't think that this is something that is in use, but it was used in World War II. Even if the American ships had air cover, these gliders could come in at such a rate that the American ship defenses could be saturated. if enough of the glider bombs came in over extended periods, even with air cover. So this was a very destructive bomb that they were using. So there were considerations of these glider bombs and also what the kamikaze planes could do in terms of amassing enormous American casualties. And they had done, the numbers, the future war gaming on this. Well, if this goes on, they're going to amass, this many casualties. And that was the background to both Yalta and the Potsdam conferences. Also the background of the decision to use the atom bomb. Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin met at Yalta in the Crimea, February 4 through 12, 1945. And the purpose was to agree on the most pressing issues of the war as it stood and the immediate post-war period. Quigley writes that since the war, and remember that this book was written just like 20 years, published 20 years after the war. I guess he said it took him that long to write it, but he said that partisan propaganda has made the conference and its decisions distorted. And so it's difficult for any historian to reconstruct. But his thoughts was that the conference was actually at the time considered to be cordial and cooperative and optimistic. One of the main things that was being hashed out at Yalta was the rules of the United Nations organization. And all of those points seemed to be settled with ease. Stalin accepted Roosevelt's suggestion that the members of the Security Council be unable to veto any discussion of disputes involving themselves within the council. And then the Anglo-American representatives accepted Soviet demands for extra seats in the assembly by offering them a couple of extra seats, one for the Ukraine and one for White Russia. On the issue of Poland, the Russians were given most of what they wanted. The Curzon line of 1919 was accepted as the eastern frontier, and then all three powers agreed that all of the Japanese imperialist gains at the expense of Russia and China since 1854 should be undone. So they really the plan was to absolutely cripple Japan. Then there was the, going back in time, so Yalta's 1945, the first Cairo conference was Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek, and that was December in 1943. And the outcome of that conference was that Japan would be expelled from all territories that she had taken by violence and greed. So during this period of the war, the great powers were thoroughly disillusioned with China. China just wasn't living up to expectations. Trade was in a state of semi-collapse. Inflation was rampant. Capital, and capital, it wasn't just money, but the farm tools and implements, roads, communications were worn out. The Kuomintang party was the dominant party. They were thoroughly corrupt. Highly disciplined communist armies had taken over much or most of northwestern China, and they seemed to have local support. So America had hopes that they would be able to fuse these two parties, but their hopes and plans broke down because the Kuomintang flat out refused, and the communists were in fairly remote regions and couldn't really be, I guess, communicated with properly. So Roosevelt was so disillusioned with Chiang's lack of energy and fighting the Japanese that he suggested General Stilwell be given command of all of the Chinese forces. And Chiang was pretty outraged by that suggestion. So on September the 16th, 1944, his answer to that suggestion was the demand that Stilwell be removed from China. And so the circumstances, it made it clear to American military leaders that they should just welcome a Soviet, an intervention of the Soviet forces against Japan on the mainland of Asia, and welcome the first atomic bombs to their arsenal of weapons. Quigley described the making of the first atomic bombs as a long, complex, technical study that most historians want to omit. But he said it's not possible to understand the history of the mid-20th century until you have some understanding of how that was achieved. Many of the top nuclear scientists were refugees from fascism to England and the United States. And we won't divert too much here, but the after-war reading and studies on Operation Paperclip are certainly interesting, but I've always thought that there was a lot more going on than just a bunch of very well-trained, intelligent, fearful of fascism refugee scientists at work. It's just my opinion there. So anyway, he describes them as being mostly refugees from fascism that had ended up in England or the United States. Refugees so fearful of Hitler, and fearful that Hitler would be the first to obtain the atomic bomb, that they prevailed upon Einstein. And remember, Einstein is not who we think he was. He has certainly been given the Hollywood Royal treatment of the most amazing scientist who ever lived. But at any rate, they prevailed upon Einstein to allow his name to be used so that they could get Roosevelt's attention. So think about it. This is really what Quigley's saying. These refugee scientists go to Einstein and say, Einstein, get Roosevelt's attention and tell him we want to build an atomic bomb. General Leslie Groves, so obviously Roosevelt liked the idea. General Leslie Groves was given command of the project, and it was done with what he describes as fanatical secrecy. This project that we call the Manhattan Project. Fanatical secrecy, an expenditure of $2 billion. I had to look that one up because I always want to know what is that in today's dollars. So this will be one for you to wrap your heads around. $2 billion, and I guess, what would that be, 43 when they embarked on that, would be 386, it's a bunch of billions, 386,872,000,000. I mean, it's crazy. And then the work of about 150,000 persons. And remember, again, this was all top secret. Now, Roosevelt died suddenly, April the 12th, 1945, and his vice president, Truman, didn't know anything about the atomic project. He was informed of it by the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. And remember Stimson, Skull and Bones, the founding member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So I think this is a good thing to remember, any of you who still participate in the voting system, is that your elected officials are often pretty clueless about what's really going on. It's other people in their cabinet, other important players who are really pulling the strings. Truman thought, well, gosh, Roosevelt died and I didn't know anything about this, so we got to get on top of it. He appointed somebody named James Burns as Secretary of State, but unfortunately, Burns knew as little about the problems of foreign policy as Truman did. Meanwhile, in England, Churchill called for the first election in 10 years. And the outcome of that was a smashing 2-1 victory, Labour over Conservatives. And so Churchill was out and Clement Attlee was in. This is just kind of an interesting of the changing of the guard, but how the policies and the agendas keep going forward. The Potsdam Conference opened in July, on the 17th of July, 1945, and it lasted until August the 2nd. But on July 28, so 11 days into the conference, Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin, his new foreign secretary, went over and replaced Churchill and Eden. I think that was Anthony Eden at Potsdam. So Quigley suggests that the fact that Stalin was the sole survivor of the big three heads of government that had so often conferred during this war, it weakened the West in this last terminal conference. The chief aim of the U.S., and this is interesting to me, was a post-war world within the structure of the United Nations, whose charter they adopted in San Francisco on June the 25th. So now it's July. So the key outcome here is United Nations. July 16, while Truman was in Europe and he was surveying the devastation of Berlin, all of these atomic scientists were gathered on an open plain in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Quigley writes, there was an implosion-type plutonium bomb at the top of a steel tower 100 feet high that was detonated at 5:30 a.m. The result was an explosion beyond all expectations. A burst of blinding light, far brighter than the sun, expanded into a ball of fire 2 miles high, which expanded as a great mushrooming pillar of radioactive smoke, and dust surged upward to a height of almost 8 miles. The light was seen 180 miles away by early risers, and the sound split windows at that same distance. At the scene, General Thomas F. Farrell said to General Groves, "The war is over." Quigley writes that the scientists were stricken with horror. And I don't believe that. A message reached Stimson in Potsdam on the 17th. Babies satisfactorily born. This information was given to Churchill when he arrived at the conference. He understood the significance, but his chief of staff was Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook, and he belittled Churchill's excitement. There's actually a quote in here that quickly gives us that Churchill had become a little bit too exuberant, like an American. According to Quigley, most politicians and military men of all armies shared Allenbrook's ignorance and scientific illiteracy. But he said, fortunately, Truman did not share that ignorance. On July the 18th, Truman ordered that the second bomb be dropped on Japan as soon as it was ready. And on July 14, he chose a list of possible targets. Those targets that ended up on the final list were Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagata, and Nagasaki. And Quigley tells us that Secretary Stimson, again, this is Quigley telling us, was moved by the tears of Professor Reischauer and by his own memories of Kyoto, and persuaded Truman to drop Kyoto from the list, a city of temples and shrines and artistic treasures. So ultimately, they settled on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the conference on July the 24th, Truman just mentioned casually, kind of an offhand remark, because they had wanted to keep the details secret from the Soviets, which is interesting. But eventually they needed to say something. So the way that Truman put it across was, he said, to Stalin, hey, we just had a successful test of a new weapon, and it has unusual destructive force. And Quigley writes that the Russian premier showed no special interest. He said that the atom bomb thus played no role at Potsdam. The chief task there was to lay out the basis of a peace settlement and to structure how the United Nations was to work. I want to read just a little section on 823, maybe into 824, on the chief principles for post-war Germany that were established at Potsdam. They are: 1, permanent and total disarmament and dispersal of all military forces; 2, complete denazification of public and private life; 3, nullification of all Nazi discriminatory laws; 4, punishment of individuals guilty of war crimes and atrocities; 5, indefinite postponement of any Central German government, and thus any German peace treaty, but maintenance of a central national administrative machine to be used by the Control Council for economic activities on a national scope. 6, the decentralization and democratization of political life and of the judicial system. 7, a multi-party system with only Nazi groups forbidden. And 8, democratization and westernization of German education. And 9, the establishment of basic Western freedoms of speech, press, religion, and labor union activities. And then Quigley also writes about the reparations and the idea of how Germany's industrialized and agriculture section were to be more or less used by the victors. On July the 26th, 1945, Truman, Attlee, and Chiang Kai-shek issued an ambiguous ultimatum to Japan. They warned Japan that it must accept immediate, unconditional surrender or suffer complete and utter destruction. There was no specified atomic threat. The Japanese premier was Admiral Suzuki, and he was caught in a trap. A serious effort to surrender would put him in danger of being murdered by militarists, and his secret efforts had been rebuffed by the West as being too vague. And again, I'll read a little bit. Basically, as an outcome of this, or a result of feeling trapped, he just issued a public statement that the Potsdam Declaration was unworthy of notice. So this section at the very end of the chapter is about the heavy cruiser, the Indianapolis, and the atom bomb. And I recommend, that you can read a little bit or watch a little bit, but it's something that is just so horrible. Everything about it is so horrifying. It's very hard. Certainly somebody like Quigley is not doing the horrors of it justice. But what happened on the 26th of July was that the heavy cruiser, the Indianapolis, which was loaded up with new anti-aircraft and radar equipment, but was unequipped with underwater submarine detection devices, unloaded the bomb without its last essential part of uranium-235 on Tinian, an island. It put to sea at once, and in the night of July 29th, between Guam and Leyte, was practically blown apart by torpedoes from Japanese submarine, the I-58. Now, everything about this story, again, is just one of these head-scratching things. The purpose of this top secret mission was to put all of the components of the bomb, less the uranium, on an island. So it's a very important mission. But they went on that mission without underwater submarine detection devices. It's just bizarre. So they've unloaded the components, and they're on their way away, and they get blown apart by a Japanese submarine. In 14 minutes, all communications were knocked out. The great ship rolled over and dived to the bottom. 1/3 of her 1,200 men were already dead. The rest were left struggling in the water. 4 days passed without anyone in the American Armed Forces asking a question about the Indianapolis. Then an American plane spotted survivors in a large oil patch. And 316 survivors were picked up in the next few days, but the bomb was safe on Tinian. My first recollection of learning about the USS Indianapolis was in the Hollywood movie Jaws. And there was a good actor named Robert Shaw who played a survivor. It's a piece of fiction, but he played a survivor that goes out and helps hunt for the sharks. And of course, his motivation was that he had been left in the water for 5 days waiting for rescue and seeing all of his friends and fellow soldiers, fellow Navy men eaten by sharks. And the story, I mean, it breaks your heart if you ever see documentaries. Everything about it, it makes me want to cry. I can't even imagine what it would be like to be blown up off of a ship and then in the water. And what happens when you're there, they had, like a sip of water in the morning, and then they could have a sip in the afternoon. They were dying of thirst. Some of them naturally drank the salt water, and drinking salt water causes you to hallucinate. It makes you go mad. Sailors who came in on the ships once they were spotted and they were being rescued said that the men were so waterlogged that when they went to pull them out of the water, their skin was literally, it was just like loose and sagging and in some cases pulling away. They were screaming in agony. And some of the survivors also said that the shrieks of a man being taken down by a shark, it's an unforgettable, agonizing scream that they're left remembering forever. Some of the people who came in to rescue them said, the shock. One man I heard, who was a soldier, he said, imagine being an 18-year-old soldier and you're rescuing somebody. He's got a life raft on and you pull him out of the water and you see that he has no legs because his legs the lower half of his body has been removed by a shark, been bitten off. And imagine what that would be like for the 18-year-old rescuer. And I thought, imagine what it would be like for the 18-year-old boy who's just had his legs bitten off. I mean, it's just it's such a terrible thing. The whole story of the USS Indianapolis from start to finish is really pretty brutal. But let's turn your focus over to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the absolute devastation of an atomic bomb, the way that this is described. The Enola Gay has its bomb, and they've loaded it up. Little boy, that was it. Gets loaded up on the B-29, the Enola Gay. Orders were to dive for maximum speed, turn 150 degrees the moment the bomb was released. Parsons directly violated his orders to arm the bomb before it was loaded in the plane because he had seen several B-29s en route to Japan crash on takeoff, and he realized an atomic accident might destroy the Tinian airfield with its hundreds of multi-million-dollar planes and so forth and tens of thousands of men. 6.5 hours later, 1,700 miles north of Tinian, the Enola Gay came in sight of its target. The doomed city lay quiet in flooding early morning sunshine. At 9:15, precisely on schedule, the giant plane went into its bombing run at 31,600 feet, speed 328 miles an hour. The bomb was released. Seconds ticked off as the bomb fell almost 5 miles to 2,000 feet. Then the two masses of uranium came together at lightning speed and turned to energy. The fireball expanded outward, enveloping the center of the city, its intense heat and blast driving outward to shatter buildings and ignite the debris. 15 miles away, the Enola Gay was slapped twice by the concussion. An hour and a half later, from 360 miles away, the crew could look back and still see the mushroom cloud rearing up to 40,000 feet. Under that cloud, at least 40,000 Japanese were killed instantly. An additional 12,000 died in the next few days, and eventually 60,175 perished, with an equal number injured. The city was over half destroyed. You know, Darin had mentioned earlier that when you have these reunions, the tragedy of never knowing, of always buying the propaganda, that is one of the most heartbreaking aspects to me. I know Alan has talked about it before, that you want people to understand the agenda because of, the babies coming up and the children coming up and the future generations, the future of humanity. But Alan has said it isn't just the future of humanity. It's everything that came before. All of the people who live and die, and they don't understand what a massive lie they've been under. These wars that are not at all for the reasons that we are told they are, and the suffering, and to see these men whose lives have been destroyed, just taking the USS Indianapolis as an example, when they were interviewing survivors, still weeping, the broken marriages and the alcoholism and waking up in the night and shrieking with the horror of it, still thinking that they did a wonderful thing. And one of them said, if we hadn't done that and Hitler and Japan would have won, where would we be? And, that's it. My answer to that question is we'd be exactly where we are, because nothing is done for the reasons that we are told. And they, talked to Japanese, even survivors of these two atomic bombs, and soldiers said Japanese people came up to them right afterwards and said, thank you so much. This ended the war. And one Japanese woman was saying, without those atomic bombs, we would have just kept fighting. Our leaders would have, made us fight. The loss of life would have, then the Americans would have had to invade and land, and the loss of life is incalculable. So that's how propaganda works. And it guts me, I can tell you that. But that is it for that. For me, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Melissa. That was almost 4 hours we've been going.
We did it again. I thought we'd be quicker, but nope.
I tried to cut mine. The second half of my section, I did break it down a bit more. I escaped a lot of some of the excess, but quickly just pulls you in, and you have to read. It's what I said last week. It takes what it takes, it's just. Yeah.
Is there anybody in the group here that wants to pipe in with something?
Just to say thank you to both of you. That was quite a marathon, there's no doubt about it. And certainly I learned some stuff tonight that I hadn't known previously about the Second World War. God bless.
Thank you, Fred.
Well, I wanted to say, hopefully somebody else has a little pipe in, but I just wanted to mention, I don't want to announce it, but I do believe that Chapter 16, The New Age, there are 2 people volunteering to cover that. I don't know the schedule of our next get-together. I know Chapter 17 that Rob is going to share that chapter with me. So again, I'm not sure of the timing, but I guess we'll sort that all out. And if there is someone who, I think we'll probably almost be into January, but if there's somebody who wants to pitch in on Chapter 18, just let us know. But if anybody, you hung in for this marathon, so if there's anybody that wants to add in here, go ahead.
Hi, it's Dan here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just going out to my garage. So I've been reading and listening, and I'd like to thank you for your efforts. It's quite an undertaking, but I have some things to add. I think Quigley's, he's quite an extraordinary individual if you look at his background. He was very good at math, and I think his lowest mark was actually in history, where he got a C, but he became interested in history because it involved the formulation of ideas. So anyways, that's, I've been looking at his background. I think he's giving us a primer on how to shift the Overton window. He was an incredible individual. I could see him, at first I questioned the book because there was no subject index or bibliography. But I think he's the type of individual that could actually sit down and do a lecture on this nonstop. So he's got a breadth of knowledge. And what I'm noticing is it's not so much what he's telling us, it's the things that he's not telling us. And I think he doesn't want to upset a certain group of people. And I'm just going to go backwards today. With Japan, the one thing that wasn't mentioned, you did mention in that for some strange reason, they didn't tell the Russians of their intentions with the nuclear weapons. But Russia had just cut through Manchuria like a knife through soft butter. And Truman was very concerned about Russia. And that was part of his impetus for dropping the bomb. And then, the other thing that struck me very strange or very off was, like, General Patton only was mentioned twice in less than a sentence. He was a major contributor to the Battle of the Bulge, and also in the African campaign, he won the major tank battle in Tunisia against Rommel, and that wasn't mentioned. And I think when you look at Patton, I think he died suspiciously. And I don't think Patton played along with the same people that Quigley had respect for. So, you have Patton sort of is ignored. And then you look at Dunkirk. What did Dunkirk get? Two sentences? And that was a major undertaking. They did reference that 3,500 Canadians had died. But part of the story there, if you look into it, is the British intelligence was trying to capture the Enigma machine. And so they wanted to do the same thing to the Germans that they did to the Japanese. And then you think about it, well, what's 3,500 lives in the overall scheme of things? So, and then you keep on going back, and I sort of I've been reading all summer, but I just joined recently, so I hope I'm not covering something that's been covered before. But when we were talking about the Polish campaign earlier, I know Quigley would have known about this, but there was a Bloody Sunday in Polish history on September 3rd, 1939, where 5,500 Germans were killed in the city of Bromberg. And it was an ethnic cleansing. And this was one of the reasons why Germany jumped in and did the Blitz there. So there's a lot of things that he would have been aware of that he's not emphasizing. And I think he's trying to, and if you look at the time, 1966, like if you think we have asleep people now, can you imagine what it was like then with all the war veterans? And, I know when I was a kid, in 1966, I was scrambling home to watch Rat Patrol and Combat. So, he lived in he was dealing with a lot of veterans. He was also, he was a Kennedy Democrat, if I understand things. So I really think he was trying to gently shift the Overton window, and there's lessons for us today in the circumstances, that we're experiencing. And the other thing I've noticed, it's the same playbook over and over and over again. If you're following current events in the Ukraine from, a realistic perspective, or even in Israel. So I just wanted to add that. I don't know what people think, but I'd welcome your feedback.
Dan?
Yes.
About Patton. I can't mine quote, but I remember reading a little bit on Patton and for the quotes he's alleged to have made. And I think you're right. He was quite, he sort of, in the things he said, he spoke out against the war. He wasn't for the war. So he wasn't in the club. And, I think you're onto something there. It's quite right.
Yeah, well, Patton was assassinated.
Also, he was very vocal. He was very vocal that the Soviet Union was an enemy, not an ally, and that the Western forces, the true allies, needed to just keep going and going into Russia.
Exactly. That
was not a popular sentiment.
Yeah, that was definitely one thing. And honestly, with the Battle of the Bulge, he moved his unit, the Third Army, 100 miles in poor weather conditions and saved them. So I don't think he was even supposed to move. And I think in the scheme of things that the Germans were supposed to have a more important counterattack. You know, that's my impression of things. But Patton was assassinated. There was apparently the car was rigged to terminate him. So I did some reading on that. But when I'm looking at Quigley, this guy was an outstanding individual. It's not like the history professors that we're acquainted with that couldn't get on into law school and decided to do a master's, and then poof, you know, they were a draft dodger and teaching at a university in my old university in Sudbury. Quigley was an outstanding individual. And the fact, you know, I did some reading on him today. He was involved with the Kennedys. And maybe, you know, if you read some of the quotes from John F. Kennedy, one that stands out that I read this week, where he was talking that there were plans to make us a society of slaves, and he wasn't going to let that happen. That's just paraphrasing. I can find the quote. You know, I think he was trying to teach us how to shift the Overton window, and it's a process. It's not an event. And if you look at our struggles with COVID, my God, people are dying, and the governments are not admitting anything. It's out in all-cause mortality. You know, the stats are there, and he's teaching us that it's a process, not an event. And there's a certain way to do it, and you can't ruffle feathers. There's a certain statesmanship involved. And if you look at the similarities between with Alan, I didn't know him. I just listened to him, but he was a man of immense knowledge, but he knew how to state things. You know, he knew how to put things forth, and it would stick with you. It sticks with you. And Quigley's like that. So I think he's giving us a primer on how to shift the Overton window. I'm sort of joining in at the best part of the book. It only gets better from here. And I just really appreciate your efforts and facilitation in this regard.
Well, thanks for being here, Dan, and thanks for your input. I appreciate that. You know, I was just on Quigley's, I think it's called carrollquigley.org the other day, and I stumbled on his dissertation, which I hadn't seen before. I've got to go back and download it and get it. But anyway, he said that this was Quigley's words, that he could not get his dissertation published because no historians had adequate background to understand what he was writing, and therefore they wouldn't engage with the material.
Well, exactly. And if you look at some of the academics and intellectuals that were ignored, look at the censorship around the Ukraine war, for example, or the censorship around the situation in the Middle East. You know, they're not willing to engage.
Well, do we have a pitch in from anyone else?
Did anyone mention his famous quote, "We defeated the wrong enemy"?
Yeah, that's exactly what he said. He said we should be going after the Soviets right now. Let's just keep going and take them out because they're going to be a problem. And you know what? He was right.